Jasmine had always prided herself on the quiet, unassuming life she led in the small town of Ridgebrook. Every morning was the same: the comforting hum of the coffee machine, the routine of getting her kids ready for school, and the calm walk to her car as the sun began to rise. She didn't need excitement or drama to feel fulfilled. Being a loving mother and wife was enough. She'd had her share of challenges, like every woman, but she was resilient. Today, like every other day, Jasmine had a few errands to run after dropping off her kids at school. The scent of fresh pastries from the local bakery filled the air as she passed through Main Street. She waved to old friends and neighbors, exchanging pleasantries that made Ridgebrook feel like more of a family than a town. Life was simple, almost idyllic, but Jasmine had always known that simplicity often masked the undercurrents of something deeper. Still, she'd never thought the quiet town of Ridgebrook could be the backdrop for anything extraordinary, let alone something that would change her life forever. It all began after her shift at the local diner ended. She had parked her car in the lot behind the diner, locked it, and walked out, ready to head home. It had been a busy day, and she was looking forward to unwinding with her family. She pulled out of the parking lot, not knowing that she was about to become entangled in something much darker than she could have imagined. As she approached the stop sign near the edge of town, she noticed a group of officers sitting in their patrol cars, seemingly stationed at the corner. It was nothing out of the ordinary. Police officers patrolled the area regularly, keeping watch over Ridgebrook. But something about the way they stared at her as she drove past felt off. She shook the feeling away and turned onto Maple Street, the route she took to head home. But then she saw the lights. At first, Jasmine didn't realize they were for her. The bright flash of blue and red filled the rearview mirror, and the sharp sound of sirens blared behind her. She wasn't speeding, hadn't run a light, and was certain she hadn't broken any traffic laws. She pulled over, rolling down her window to see what the issue was. A tall officer with an unkempt appearance walked toward her car. His face was hard, stern, and his eyes were cold. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle," he commanded before she could even speak. His tone wasn't one of concern. It was a demand, almost a warning. Jasmine hesitated for a moment, confused. There had to be some mistake. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though her nerves were beginning to fray. "You're driving under suspicion of illegal activity. Step out of the car now," he repeated, his hand hovering near his holster. Jasmine's heart began to race. She had heard of situations like this: racism, profiling, unjust treatment. But she never thought she would be in the middle of one. She opened her door slowly, stepping out to face the officer. Two more officers emerged from their cars. One was older, with a graying beard, and the other was young, no older than 25, with a look of indifference on his face. They all gathered around her car, as if ready for something more than just a routine stop. Jasmine felt uneasy, like she was being watched, scrutinized under a microscope. Her body tensed as she instinctively reached for her phone in her pocket, ready to record if things escalated. "What's going on? Why am I being stopped?" she asked, her voice trembling, trying to keep her composure. The older officer, who stood at the rear of her car, glanced at her dismissively. "You're under suspicion of transporting illegal substances, ma'am." "We've been tipped off." Jasmine could hardly believe what she was hearing. A tip-off? She was just an ordinary woman trying to get home. "That's absurd. I don't have anything illegal." "You're mistaken." The young officer stepped forward, his face hardening. "Ma'am, you don't need to speak to us like that. We're just doing our job." His tone was condescending, dismissive. Jasmine's instinct told her to stay calm, but the growing tension in the air felt suffocating. "Look," she said, trying to reason with them. "I don't know what this is about, but I'm not involved in anything like that. I just want to go home." But the officers weren't listening. The tall officer moved closer to her, his eyes narrowing. "You'll need to come with us, ma'am. We'll get to the bottom of this." Panic began to rise in Jasmine's chest, but she held herself together. I don't have to go anywhere. I'm not breaking any laws. That's when it happened. The older officer reached into the front seat of her car, yanking her purse out of the passenger seat. As if on cue, the young officer moved in quickly, slamming his hand onto her hood. The scene was escalating faster than Jasmine could process. What was happening? She hadn't done anything wrong. She knew it, and they knew it. The tension in the air was palpable, and Jasmine could feel it. "Get back in your car," the officer barked at her. Jasmine froze for a split second, weighing her options. Her instincts screamed at her to fight back, but she knew she needed to stay calm. Her hands clenched into fists, but before she could respond, the tall officer walked over to the back of the car, pulling something from his belt. She couldn't see what it was, but the movement was deliberate. She felt a rising sense of dread. And then, to her horror, he poured a liquid from a gas can onto her car. The sound of the gasoline sloshing against her tires sent a cold chill through her body. Before she could say anything, before she could stop it, he flicked a lighter. The flame shot up, engulfing her car in an instant. "No, stop. What are you doing?" Jasmine screamed, rushing toward her car, but the officers blocked her path. The flames were consuming the vehicle, the heat unbearable even from a distance. Her heart sank as she watched the smoke billow into the air. It was her car, but it felt like something far worse had been taken from her. The officer smirked, clearly enjoying the terror he was causing. "It's too late now." Jasmine's hands shook as she struggled to make sense of what had just happened. Her car was burning in front of her, destroyed in a matter of seconds, and she had no idea why. It wasn't just the destruction of her property. It was the feeling of powerlessness that gripped her. She was at the mercy of these officers, who held her life in their hands with no explanation, no accountability. Before she could process the full weight of the situation, the sound of tires screeching broke through the air. Jasmine turned to see a familiar car pulling into the scene. The car of her husband, Marcus. He'd been at work, but when he saw the smoke from the fire, he rushed to her side. Marcus had always been the calm one, but seeing his wife standing there, helpless, staring at her burning car, made something snap inside him. As he approached the scene, the officer's expressions changed. "Get out of here," the young officer yelled, but Marcus didn't flinch. He stood tall, his eyes locked on the officers. He had seen enough in his life to recognize injustice, and the way they were treating Jasmine, his wife, was something he would not stand for. "What the hell is going on here?" Marcus's voice cut through the tension like a knife. The officers were now visibly on edge. They hadn't expected him, not like this. "I need answers," Marcus demanded, his tone unwavering. "What have you done to my wife?" The situation had just escalated beyond anything anyone could have predicted. The calm, quiet town of Ridgebrook would never be the same after this day. The officers froze for a brief moment, taken aback by Marcus's sudden presence. They had expected a woman caught in shock, vulnerable and alone. But now they were facing a man who wasn't just going to accept this injustice. He was ready to confront them head-on. The young officer stepped back slightly, his eyes darting nervously toward his colleagues. But the older officer, the one who had initiated the destruction, took a deep breath and squared his shoulders. "What's going on here is none of your business, sir," the older officer said gruffly, his voice lacking the conviction it once held. Marcus's gaze sharpened, his jaw clenched in disbelief. "None of my business," Marcus echoed, his voice low but laced with fury. "That's my wife's car burning in front of me. How is that none of my business?" He took a step closer, his towering frame making the officers shift uncomfortably. "I said get back in your car and leave." The young officer tried again, his voice strained, but the tone of command that had once filled his words had evaporated. Marcus was no longer just another bystander. He was a threat, someone who could see through their lies. The older officer noticed the shift, his hands tightening around the baton clipped to his belt. He knew the power they held over the community, and the last thing he wanted was for things to escalate further. "We're just doing our job, man," the older officer said, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his confidence. Marcus's eyes flicked to the burning car, the smoke billowing into the late afternoon sky, the flames casting eerie shadows on the street. It was no longer about the car. It was about control. Jasmine had become their target, but now Marcus was the catalyst for something bigger. "You're doing your job?" Marcus asked, his voice dangerous. "You destroy her property, put her in danger, and now you're going to stand there and tell me it's your job." He let out a bitter laugh. "I think you've done enough. Your job is about to get a lot harder." As he spoke, Marcus pulled out his phone, already dialed to the number of their attorney. He had seen enough corruption in his lifetime to know that this wasn't an isolated incident. He didn't just need answers. He needed the truth to come to light, and he wasn't going to let them bury it. The young officer's eyes widened at the sight of the phone. The last thing they wanted was a legal confrontation, especially not in front of an entire neighborhood that was already starting to notice what was going on. "What's that supposed to mean?" The younger officer spat, taking a step forward. But Marcus didn't flinch. "It means," Marcus said, locking eyes with the officer, "that you've just made a mistake you won't be able to undo. The whole town is going to know what you've done. And it's not just about the car anymore. It's about accountability. You don't get to treat people like this." The older officer's face darkened, his grip on the baton tightening, but before he could respond, Marcus's phone call was answered. "Yes, this is Marcus Henderson. I need you to get down here now. We've got a situation." The officers exchanged a quick glance, and it was clear to them that things were no longer in their control. They had hoped for a quick intimidation, an easy way to intimidate Jasmine into submission. But with Marcus involved, they realized they were dealing with a man who had the will, the means, and the knowledge to fight back. They had miscalculated, and the power dynamic was quickly shifting. The older officer took a step toward Marcus, trying to assert control. "You don't want to escalate this any further, sir," he said with a forced calm. "You'll regret it." Marcus didn't even blink. "I'm already regretting what you've done to my wife. You want me to regret fighting for her? Go ahead. Make my day." Jasmine, who had been standing on the periphery of the scene, watching the exchange in stunned silence, felt her pulse quicken. She had always known Marcus to be the rock in their relationship, the calm in the storm, but seeing him stand up so fiercely in this moment filled her with a deep sense of gratitude and admiration. She had spent years raising their children and building their life together, but never had she seen him more determined, more fierce in his resolve. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something far greater. It was about justice. The older officer took a hesitant step back, glancing at the flames licking at the sides of the car. "We'll take care of it," he said, as if this could somehow undo the damage. But Marcus wasn't having it. "Take care of it." Marcus laughed bitterly. "You've already made your move. You can't take this back. What you've done is unforgivable." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. Jasmine moved toward her husband, still in shock, but now feeling a sense of empowerment that she hadn't felt before. She stood by his side, her hand brushing against his arm in silent support. It was the first time she truly understood the depths of the power they had as a couple, the strength they could draw from one another when faced with adversity. "Are you two finished?" Marcus asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "Or do you need more time to figure out how to make this right?" At that moment, a few of the neighbors who had been watching from their windows or across the street began to gather, murmuring amongst themselves. They had seen the smoke, heard the sirens, and now they were seeing the two officers stand there, looking like they had no idea how to handle the situation. Marcus made his move, stepping toward the officers with purpose. "I want your names, and I want your badge numbers," he said coldly. The young officer balked, his earlier bravado crumbling under the pressure. "What are you going to do with them?" "Get out of here before I make things worse for you," Marcus replied, his voice a quiet but unmistakable threat. For a moment, The tension between the two sides hung thick in the air. But the officers knew they couldn't afford to escalate things further. Slowly, the older officer stepped back, nodding toward the young officer to do the same. Without another word, the three officers retreated to their cars, though not before the older officer cast one last, spiteful glance at Marcus and Jasmine. As they drove off, leaving the smoldering remains of Jasmine's car behind them, Marcus turned to his wife. His expression softened as he reached for her hand, the fight that had just transpired fading away for a brief moment. But the damage was done. Jasmine's car was gone, reduced to ash and charred metal, but the emotional toll of the encounter was far more devastating. The reality of what had just happened began to settle in. Jasmine had faced a blatant act of aggression, but now they both knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. They had uncovered something much darker beneath the surface of their quiet town. And as Marcus glanced around at the growing crowd of onlookers, he realized that this wasn't just about them anymore. It was about every person who had ever been wronged by the system, every voice that had been silenced. Jasmine looked at him, a mixture of fear and resolve in her eyes. "What do we do now?" Marcus squeezed her hand. "Now, we make sure they don't get away with it." The fight for justice had only just begun. The night was still, the kind of silence that followed a storm, but it was only the calm before the real chaos. Jasmine sat in their living room, the soft glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. Marcus had made a call to their attorney, but the situation felt bigger than just a legal battle. It felt like the whole town was on the brink of change, though she couldn't yet see what that change would look like. They had been violated in ways she couldn't have imagined just hours earlier. A part of her felt like the entire system had conspired against her, her family, and her community. Marcus stood by the window, staring out into the dark streets of Ridgebrook, his jaw clenched tightly. He wasn't pacing, but the tension in his posture was unmistakable. His mind raced with what needed to happen next, the wheels turning with a sense of urgency he hadn't felt before. He had always been a man of peace, a man who tried to solve problems without confrontation. But this wasn't just a problem. It was an injustice, and it was now personal. His family was under attack, and the town he loved was fractured. Jasmine sat up, glancing toward Marcus. The anger on his face was tempered by something deeper now. Determination, but also a quiet fear. "What do we do now?" she asked again, her voice softer this time, as though the weight of the question had begun to settle within her. Marcus turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. There was no hesitation, no doubt in his response. "We fight. We make sure they can't do this to anyone else." The thought of what that would mean for their family, for their future, was daunting, but Jasmine knew he was right. They had seen corruption and abuse of power before, but this was on another level. What they had just witnessed wasn't a random act of violence. It was an attempt to intimidate, to put them in their place. And Jasmine, for the first time, realized the extent of the power they were up against. The next morning, Marcus made a series of phone calls, contacting every local journalist, every activist, every lawyer he knew. He wasn't going to let this go quietly into the night. He was going to expose it for what it was, no matter the cost. But as the hours passed, the reality of the situation became clearer. This wasn't just a problem for them. It was a problem for the entire community. The corruption in the police force had been growing for years, but no one had been brave enough to speak up. Jasmine's car had just been the catalyst that brought it all to the surface. When the call came from the local news station, Marcus could barely contain his fury. "We're running the story tonight," the reporter said. "This is going to make waves, but I need your permission to use the footage of the car burning." Marcus didn't hesitate. "Use it. All of it. The world needs to see what's really going on here." That night, as Ridgebrook watched in stunned silence, the story aired. The footage of Jasmine's car being set alight by the officers played on repeat, each frame highlighting the coldness in their actions, the way they'd taken something precious from her with a casual disregard for her humanity. It was a raw, unfiltered look at how the system, meant to protect, had instead become a source of terror for the very people it was supposed to serve. But as the story spread, so did the consequences. Ridgebrook was no longer a sleepy town. It was a battleground, and the lines had been drawn. People began to take sides, some in support of the officers, citing the danger of the situation, while others rallied around Marcus and Jasmine, demanding justice. The more people spoke out, the more tension grew. Local businesses were threatened with boycotts if they didn't choose a side, and people began to avoid the streets where the officers lived, fearing retribution. Jasmine's role in this story began to evolve too. No longer just the victim, she had become a symbol of resistance. The calls from the press were constant, each interviewer asking the same thing. How did she feel about the way she had been treated? And every time, Jasmine answered with the same quiet resolve. She wasn't just angry. She was determined to make sure this didn't happen to anyone else. But Marcus knew that it wasn't enough to be angry. They needed to act. The calls from their lawyer had been promising, and the legal process was beginning to move. But the longer it dragged on, the more dangerous things became. The officers, though temporarily placed on leave, still had influence. The threat of violence loomed over their heads, not just from the police, but from those who supported them. It was clear now that Ridgebrook wasn't just divided over an issue. It was divided over an ideology. People who had once been neighbors, friends, and colleagues now looked at each other with distrust, suspicion, and even fear. One evening, as the tension seemed to reach its breaking point, Marcus returned home late, his face drawn and tired. He'd been meeting with activists, legal experts, and the few community members who still had the courage to speak out. He walked through the door and found Jasmine sitting at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for him. "What happened?" she asked before he could speak. "I spoke to the mayor today," Marcus said, sitting down across from her. He's trying to distance himself from the situation, but he knows it's bigger than just the police force. "They're scared, Jasmine. People are scared. But we can't let that stop us." Jasmine's eyes met his, her expression unwavering. "So we keep pushing, right?" Marcus nodded. "We don't stop until the truth comes out. We expose it all. Every last bit of it." But even as they spoke, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of their control. Every day that passed, the more dangerous the situation became. What had started as an act of injustice was now a movement, a fight for justice that was quickly escalating into something far bigger than they had ever expected. That night, as Marcus and Jasmine lay in bed, the sound of sirens in the distance seemed louder than usual. It was a haunting reminder that the world around them was changing, and not for the better. Jasmine closed her eyes, trying to push away the fear creeping into her thoughts. But as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would bring something even more dangerous. The fight was far from over, and the stakes were rising higher with each passing hour. The weeks following the broadcast of the news story felt like a blur. Ridgebrook, once a peaceful town with a strong sense of community, had become a battleground of sorts. The story had spread beyond local news, and it wasn't just the town that was watching. It was the entire country. People from all over had begun to rally behind Jasmine and Marcus, some sending letters of support, while others offered legal advice or assistance. But not all the attention was positive. The divide in Ridgebrook had deepened, and the animosity between the police force and the people grew each day. The tension was palpable, and with it, the fear that something worse could happen. The protests started small at first, with just a handful of people showing up outside the police station, holding signs and chanting for justice. But as the days passed, the numbers swelled. It wasn't just black residents of Ridgebrook who were out there. It was people of every race, age, and background who had had enough. It became clear that Jasmine's story had struck a nerve, igniting a spark that had been simmering under the surface for years. But with every new rally, with every new voice speaking out, the tension only escalated. Marcus had seen this kind of division before. He knew how quickly things could turn ugly, how easily a peaceful protest could devolve into chaos. Jasmine tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy in her life, but it was getting harder and harder. Everywhere she went, people stopped her on the street, offering their condolences or words of support. It felt overwhelming, like everyone was watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. She couldn't even go to the grocery store without feeling eyes on her, or without hearing whispered conversations behind her back. Some people were on her side, but others were furious, thinking she was stirring up trouble where there had been none. The stress began to take its toll. She had always been a strong woman, but the weight of the pressure, the constant worry for her family, the long days spent in meetings with their lawyer, and the endless news coverage, it was beginning to break her down. But through it all, Marcus remained her rock, never wavering, always the calm in the storm. Despite his outward calm, however, Marcus couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was about to happen, something that would push the situation into a new dangerous phase. The police, despite the mounting pressure and protests, hadn't been held accountable. The officers involved in the burning of Jasmine's car were still on paid leave, and the town's mayor, who had initially spoken out in favor of justice, had begun to backtrack. Marcus had met with the mayor in private several times, trying to get him to take a firmer stance against the corrupt officers. But every time, he came away empty-handed, as the mayor danced around the issue, making empty promises and offering weak assurances. Then came the tipping point. One evening, after another long day of protests and legal meetings, Marcus received a call. It was from one of the activists who had been working with them, a local business owner named Tyrone. His voice was urgent, tight with fear. "Marcus, you need to get down here. Something's happened." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "What's going on?" "It's the police," Tyrone said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're getting ready to make a move. They're not going to let this go on much longer." Marcus didn't need to hear more. He grabbed his keys, rushing out the door. Jasmine, who had been sitting in the living room, looked up in alarm as he stormed past. "Where are you going?" she called after him. "I'll be back soon," Marcus said, trying to sound reassuring, though his voice betrayed his anxiety. "Stay inside. Keep the doors locked." But Jasmine knew better than to argue. She could see the fear in his eyes. She didn't need him to say it aloud. They both knew that the situation was escalating, and this time, it wasn't just the police who were dangerous. The atmosphere in the town had shifted. People were angry, so angry that they were willing to do anything to protect the status quo. And Marcus, despite all his attempts to keep his family safe, was now caught in the middle of it all. By the time Marcus reached Tyrone's store, the scene was already in full swing. The police had gathered in force near the town square, and there was a growing crowd of protesters, shouting and demanding justice. Marcus pushed through the crowd, his eyes scanning for Tyrone. When he spotted him, he hurried over. "Marcus, it's bad," Tyrone said, his face pale. "They've started to show up in full riot gear. They're preparing for something. They're ready to crack down on us." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the officers move into position, their armored vests reflecting the lights from nearby street lamps. The protesters, though peaceful, were being corralled, and Marcus could feel the tension mounting. It was only a matter of time before someone did something reckless, either on the part of the police or the protesters, and that would be the spark that ignited everything. He knew he had to act quickly, or things were going to spiral out of control. "We need to get the word out," Marcus said urgently. "Tell everyone to stay calm. We can't let them use this as an excuse to escalate." But as he said the words, something changed. One of the protesters, a young man in his 20s, stepped forward and shouted at the police officers. His voice was full of rage, his fists clenched, and before anyone could stop him, he charged toward the officers, throwing a bottle in their direction. The sound of glass shattering against the pavement echoed through the night, and just like that, everything exploded. The police immediately responded with force. Tear gas canisters were fired into the crowd, and the scene quickly descended into chaos. People scattered in every direction, some running for cover, others screaming in panic. The sound of gunshots rang out in the distance, and Marcus felt his blood run cold. "Get down," Tyrone shouted, pulling Marcus to the ground. But Marcus was already looking for a way to get closer to the heart of the chaos. He needed to find Jasmine. He needed to make sure she was safe. But as he tried to push through the crowd, he realized something that stopped him dead in his tracks. The officers weren't just there to contain the crowd. They were there to send a message. They were targeting the people who had been the loudest in their calls for justice, the ones who had stood up. And among them, he saw someone he knew all too well. Officer Reed, the man who had been the first to set fire to Jasmine's car. Reed's eyes met Marcus's across the crowd, and for a moment, neither of them moved. There was a dangerous recognition in Reed's gaze, a silent acknowledgement that things were about to get much worse. Marcus's pulse raced. This was no longer just a fight for justice. It was a fight for survival. The whole town, it seemed, was on the edge of something catastrophic, and it was unclear who would come out on top. Would it be the people, rising up for justice? Or would the entrenched powers, the system that had always ruled Ridgebrook, crush them all underfoot? As the chaos around him unfolded, Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. The real battle was about to begin, and there would be no turning back. The streets of Ridgebrook were now a war zone. Tear gas clouded the air, the acrid smell burning the back of Marcus's throat as he sprinted through the chaos, trying to find Jasmine. He could hear shouts in the distance, the crackling of bullhorns ordering people to disperse, and the incessant thud of boots on pavement as officers moved in formation. The familiar hum of everyday life was gone, replaced by the harsh sounds of a community tearing itself apart. His heart was pounding in his chest, each step more urgent than the last. The scene was spiraling out of control. The protests, which had once been peaceful, were now a full-blown riot. The officers, in their riot gear, weren't just defending themselves. They were actively hunting down anyone who dared to challenge their authority. And Marcus knew that if he didn't act fast, if he didn't find a way to calm the situation, it could escalate into something much worse. He knew that Jasmine, though strong, wouldn't stand a chance against the kind of violence that was unfolding. She was caught in the middle of it all, as much a symbol of the fight for justice as she was a target. And with Reed, a man whose face had come to symbolize the very corruption they were fighting, right in the center of it all, Marcus felt a cold knot of fear tighten in his gut. The man who had set fire to Jasmine's car was now at the helm of the chaos. As he weaved through the crowd, Marcus spotted her, Jasmine, standing near a storefront, her back against the wall, her eyes wide with fear, but also determination. She was trying to keep her head down, to stay out of sight, but the chaos was closing in fast. Without a second thought, Marcus pushed forward, ducking behind a row of parked cars to avoid the line of sight of the officers. His mind raced as he formulated a plan. He had to get her to safety, but how? Suddenly, the sound of gunfire rang out. It was distant at first, a single shot that sent a wave of panic through the crowd. It wasn't enough to send people scattering just yet, but the fear it invoked was palpable. The officers, seeing the potential for escalation, responded immediately, pulling their weapons, moving in tighter circles. The crowd responded with panic, pushing and shoving as people fled, trying to outrun the authorities. But there was nowhere to go. The police had set up barricades, sealing off every exit. There was no safe space, no easy way out. Marcus's breath caught in his throat as he saw Jasmine caught in the madness. She had been pushed toward the front line by the wave of panicked bodies, and now she was too close to the officers, too exposed. He felt a surge of adrenaline as he sprinted toward her, calling her name above the clamor. "Jasmine," he shouted, pushing his way through the crowd. His voice was barely audible over the din, but it was enough. Jasmine turned toward him, her eyes wide with recognition. Her face, usually composed and calm, was now filled with fear, but there was also a flicker of something else. Hope. She didn't hesitate. As soon as she saw him, she pushed through the crowd, moving toward him with the kind of urgency that only a life-or-death situation could inspire. The moment their eyes locked, she moved faster, and they met in the middle of the street, their hands meeting in a grip that seemed to ground them both. "Marcus, we need to get out of here," Jasmine said urgently, her voice trembling. "It's getting worse. We're not safe anymore." Marcus looked around, scanning the scene. They were in the center of the chaos, surrounded by police and panicked civilians. The streets were filled with people shouting, some trying to reason with the officers, others shouting insults. In the distance, a few buildings had begun to catch fire, their windows shattered by rocks and debris thrown by the crowd. The violence had spread far beyond what anyone had expected. "We have to move," Marcus said firmly, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the alley beside the store. He glanced back once, seeing a group of officers pushing forward, their faces covered with shields, batons raised. They were coming for anyone in their path, and Marcus knew it wouldn't take much for the situation to spiral into full-scale violence. He needed to get Jasmine somewhere safe. They ducked into the alley, pressing against the brick walls, trying to stay out of sight. The sounds of the riot were muffled here, but the tension in the air was still thick. Jasmine was breathing heavily, her face flushed with fear and exertion. Marcus's mind raced as he formulated their next move. The police were closing in on the area, and the last thing he wanted was for them to be cornered. He needed to get them out of the immediate danger zone, and fast. But before he could decide on their next move, a voice broke through the silence. It was Reed. "Marcus." "Jasmine." The voice came from the mouth of the alley, cold and mocking, and for a moment, Marcus's blood froze in his veins. There, standing at the entrance of the alley, was Officer Reed, his hands resting on the grip of his baton, his eyes filled with an unsettling mix of arrogance and malice. "I knew you'd try to run," Reed sneered, taking a step forward. "You can't hide from what's coming. You think you can stand against us, against the law." Marcus's heart raced. He had been expecting this moment, had known it was coming. Reed had a personal vendetta, and he wasn't going to let them escape so easily. "Get out of our way, Reed," Marcus said, his voice low and steady, though his fists were clenched. "You've already cost us enough. We're not going to let you destroy this town any more than you already have." Reed's laugh was cruel, echoing through the narrow alley. "You think you can stop this? You're nothing but a pawn in a game you'll never understand. The town belongs to us. You're not the first to challenge us, and you won't be the last." But Marcus wasn't listening. His mind was focused, his resolve steeled. "I don't care what you think. This isn't your town anymore. It never was." Reed's expression darkened, and for a moment, Marcus thought he might charge. But then something unexpected happened. Reed's hand tightened around his baton, and just as quickly, he looked over his shoulder, his expression shifting from confidence to something darker. There was a moment of hesitation, a shift in Reed's demeanor as if he had just realized that the battle was no longer just about him and Marcus. It was about something much bigger. "You don't know who you're messing with, Henderson," Reed muttered, his voice low with anger. But instead of charging forward, he took a step back, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Something was changing, and Reed knew it. The power he had once wielded so easily was slipping from his grasp. Marcus could see it in his eyes. He wasn't the only one who had something to lose. This town, this community, was rising up. And despite all the corruption, all the power that had been used to keep them in check, it was no longer enough to keep the truth buried. Reed stepped back, his eyes still locked on Marcus and Jasmine. "You'll regret this," he spat, before turning and disappearing into the shadows, leaving them alone in the alley. The moment he was gone, Marcus turned to Jasmine, his hand still tightly gripping hers. "We're not safe yet," he said, his voice grim. But we're getting closer. The truth is coming, and it's going to change everything. As they turned to leave the alley, the distant sound of sirens and gunshots echoed in the night, but there was a new sense of purpose in their steps. The fight for justice was no longer just about one incident. It was about a system, a town, and a community that had been broken for far too long. And Marcus and Jasmine were ready to be the ones to finally bring it all to light. They weren't running anymore. They were fighting back, and it was a fight they were determined to win. The tension in the air was thick as Marcus and Jasmine navigated through the streets of Ridgebrook. The town, which had once felt like home, now seemed like a battlefield. The sounds of sirens, shouts, and the distant crackling of fires filled the air, a stark contrast to the peaceful mornings they once knew. The streets that were once lined with familiar faces were now filled with fear, uncertainty, and anger. But despite the chaos around them, something within Marcus and Jasmine had shifted. They were no longer just trying to survive. They were fighting for something bigger, something that went beyond the confines of their personal story. Jasmine's grip on Marcus's hand tightened as they made their way toward the outskirts of town, where the protests had started to subside. She could feel her heart racing, a mixture of fear and determination pounding in her chest. "Marcus," she whispered, looking up at him with a mix of gratitude and concern, "do you think it's going to be enough? The truth, do you think it's going to change anything?" Marcus's jaw was set, his face grim but resolute. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice steady, but filled with the weight of everything that had happened. "But we have to make it count. If we stop now, they'll keep doing this. And worse, we can't let them win." Jasmine nodded, her gaze fixed forward. The weight of their journey had never felt heavier than in this moment, but she understood. They had seen the corruption, felt the abuse of power firsthand, and now they knew the stakes. It wasn't just about revenge for her car or the wrongs they'd faced. It was about exposing the rot that had taken hold of their town and making sure it never happened again. They reached a quiet corner of Ridgebrook, where the town's courthouse loomed ahead, its facade a reminder of justice that had failed to show up for too long. It was here that their battle would come to a head. Marcus and Jasmine knew they had to act fast before the momentum of the protests and the growing outrage dissipated. The courthouse was now the focal point of the tension. The local activists, who had once stayed in the shadows, were now at the forefront, organizing legal battles, public speeches, and rallies in hopes of pressuring the town's leaders to take action. But Marcus knew it wasn't just about marching anymore. It was about hitting them where it would hurt the most. In the media, in the courtrooms, they had to make the corruption undeniable. It wasn't just the officers who were complicit. It was the system that had allowed them to thrive unchecked. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense, the air stale with anticipation. Marcus and Jasmine had received word from their lawyer that the officers involved in the incident would be facing a hearing. It was a chance, however slim, for justice to finally be served. The officers were still on paid leave, but the pressure was mounting. People were speaking out, the town was divided, and the evidence was clear. But there was a catch. The system had always protected its own. Marcus knew that even with the mounting public outcry, there was still a chance the officers could get away with it. They had to make the right moves. They had to play the long game. As Marcus and Jasmine walked through the courthouse steps, their faces were resolute, but their hearts were heavy. They were prepared for a long fight, but even as they entered the building, they could feel the weight of the resistance they were about to face. The powers that be had long since turned a blind eye to the abuses of the police, and now they would use every ounce of influence they had to keep the officers from facing the consequences of their actions. Inside, the court was already in session. People were gathered in clusters, some taking notes, others whispering among themselves. The buzz of conversations was muted by the tension in the air. Marcus and Jasmine found their seats at the back of the room, their eyes scanning the room, waiting for the proceedings to begin. Minutes passed, and the room grew quieter. The judge, an elderly man with a reputation for being fair but stern, entered the room, signaling for everyone to settle down. His gavel struck the sound block, and the room fell silent. The tension was palpable. Jasmine felt the weight of the eyes on her, on them both. This was the moment where everything they had worked for could either come to fruition or collapse under the weight of indifference. The officers were called forward, each of them appearing as if nothing had happened. No shame, no regret. Their uniforms were pristine, their postures rigid, and there was a sense of cold detachment in their eyes. Reed, the officer who had set fire to Jasmine's car, stood at the front, a defiant smirk on his face. It was as though he couldn't fathom that this moment could be anything other than an inconvenience. To him, this was just another day. But for Marcus and Jasmine, it was the culmination of everything they had fought for. The proceedings began, the prosecutor presenting the charges against the officers: attempted assault, abuse of power, racial profiling, and the destruction of personal property. Jasmine's heart hammered in her chest as the prosecutor spoke, his voice cutting through the stillness of the room. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the cards were stacked against them. She had seen the corruption, had felt the weight of the system in every step they took. The game was rigged, and yet this time they had a chance to expose it all. As the defense lawyer stood to present their case, Marcus's grip on Jasmine's hand tightened. The lawyer, a slick, well-dressed man who had defended officers like Reed for years, began spinning his narrative. He painted the officers as victims of a misunderstanding, as heroes simply doing their jobs. He tried to discredit the evidence, blaming the protesters for inciting violence, claiming that Jasmine had been acting out of line, and suggesting that the officers were simply following protocol. His words were smooth, carefully chosen to sow doubt in the minds of the jury and the judge. But it was clear that this was nothing more than a stall tactic. Then it was Marcus's turn. His voice was steady as he took the stand, his eyes never leaving the judge. He spoke of what had happened that night, of the brutality, the injustice, and the way his wife had been treated. His voice grew stronger as he described the fear they had both felt, not just for themselves, but for the entire community. He spoke of the years of corruption that had festered beneath the surface, of how the officers had gotten away with it for far too long. And then he looked Reed in the eye. "You can stand here and tell your lies," Marcus said, his voice filled with quiet fury. "But the truth is out there. You can't hide behind your badge anymore. We're not afraid of you." Reed's eyes narrowed, his fists clenched at his sides. There was a moment of silence, a brief pause where the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Then something shifted. For the first time since Marcus and Jasmine had entered the courthouse, the officers seemed unsure. Reed's defiance wavered, and the smirk that had once seemed so certain began to falter. It wasn't just Marcus who had stood up against him. It was the whole town, the whole community, and it was too much to ignore. The judge nodded, his gavel coming down. "The court will adjourn for the day," he said, his voice low but firm. "Tomorrow, we will begin deliberations." As the room began to empty, Marcus and Jasmine stood together, their eyes meeting. They hadn't won yet, but they had done something. They had taken the first step toward exposing the truth. They had brought the light to the darkness that had plagued their town for so long. And for the first time in a long while, Marcus believed, really believed, that they might just have a chance at winning.